Have you ever stood at the edge of your garden and truly asked yourself why we are so pathologically obsessed with straight lines? Because if you really look at nature, you will see that no forest grows in rows and no river flows like a ruler, yet we insist on imposing this rigid industrial thinking onto the soft and fluid life of our plants. For 10 years, I was just like you, believing that order was synonymous with efficiency and that tidiness was the ultimate measure of a good gardener. But the harsh reality is that we are actively choking the true potential of our soil with the very geometry we worship. To prove this, I launched a bold experiment that many called a waste of time, where I set up 5 distinct planting bed shapes on the exact same plot of land with the exact same fertilizer and the exact same water source to see if geometry really decides the destiny of a crop. I built the traditional long rows, the neat squares, the standard rectangles, the vertical stacks, and a strange fifth shape that I stumbled upon in a forgotten ancient text. The results were not just a statistical difference, they were a complete paradigm shock that forced me to reevaluate my entire belief system as I watched the first 4 shapes struggle to just survive, while that final shape exploded with life so wild and intense it was as if it had unlocked some secret biological code of creation. You simply will not believe your eyes when you see how the exact same seed, when placed in the right energy architecture, can outperform everything you thought possible. And today, I am going to walk you through this revelation so we can finally break the invisible chains that are holding your garden back. Let's start with the one we see in every textbook and every commercial farm, which is the long straight row. Because this is the shape of obedience that has been drilled into our heads since kindergarten, but when you plant in a single file line, you are essentially creating a wind tunnel that strips moisture away from the soil surface faster than you can water it, and you force each plant to stand alone against the elements like a soldier on the front line with no protection from its neighbors. Then we moved on to the raised box, specifically the square and the rectangle, which the gardening industry loves to sell you as the ultimate solution. But have you ever noticed that the corners of those boxes always dry out first? And that is because a corner is a dead zone where energy gets trapped, and fungal networks hit a hard wall and sever their connection, essentially creating a tiny prison for the root systems that just want to wander and connect. We think we are being organized by building these wooden coffins for our soil, but we are actually interrupting the capillary action that draws water up from the deep earth and isolating our plants from the surrounding microbiome. And don't even get me started on the vertical stacks that have flooded social media lately, promising huge yields in small spaces because while they look fantastic on camera, they are fighting a constant losing battle against gravity where water rushes past the roots too quickly, leaving the plants in a perpetual state of stress and thirst. All 4 of these shapes share the same fatal flaw, which is that they prioritize human convenience and aesthetic tidiness over the biological needs of the organism, because we designed them so we could walk between them or drive tractors over them or mow around them without a single thought given to how a root system actually wants to expand or how a mycorrhizal web tries to weave itself together. We have treated the garden like a factory floor composed of isolated units of production rather than a living, breathing ecosystem, and the plants in my experiment growing in these shapes looked exactly like you would expect, tired, stressed, and doing the bare minimum to survive because they were fighting the very architecture of their home. History is written by the victors, but in the world of agriculture, it has been written by the chemical corporations that silenced the true pioneers of biological wisdom, like the forgotten genius Victor Schauberger, who was known as the Water Wizard. Back in the early 20th century, this Austrian forester stood alone against the rising tide of industrialism and boldly declared that nature knows no straight lines, and that the straight line is actually the geometry of death, yet he was ridiculed by the academic elites and dismissed as a mystic because his findings threatened the very foundation of the new mechanical world order. Schauberger observed that water naturally flows in spirals and vortices to energize itself, and that trees grow in complex curves to maximize their strength, but the industrial machine could not commodify a spiral, so they buried his work under a mountain of patents for square plows and linear harvesters. It was never about what was best for the soil or the plant. It was always about what was easiest for the machine, and for decades, we have been unwitting accomplices to this crime against nature, buying into a system that was designed to sell tractors and fertilizers rather than to grow nutrient-dense food. They told us that these early permaculture heroes were crazy hermits who didn't understand modern science, but the irony is that they understood the physics of life better than any laboratory technician ever could. And while they were pushed to the margins, their ideas survived in the shadows, waiting for a generation brave enough to look past the propaganda and rediscover the lost art of working with the Earth's natural flow. And then there was the fifth shape, the wild card that I almost didn't build because it looked too messy on paper, but when I stepped into the garden mid-July, it was the only thing I could see. It was the Keyhole Garden, a perfect circle with a small wedge cut out for access, like a slice of pie missing from the hole. And while the rows were yellowing and the boxes were drying out, this circular beast was absolutely exploding with a ferocity I have never seen in 10 years of farming. It wasn't just green. It was a deep, dark, ancient green that signaled massive nutrient uptake, and the plants weren't just growing, they were climbing over each other in a chaotic symphony of abundance that made the orderly rows look like a graveyard of good intentions. I stood there, staring at this lush mountain of biomass, realizing that by simply bending the straight line into a curve, I had somehow tricked the soil into thinking it was on a forest floor rather than a farm. The tomato vines were thicker, the leaves were broader, and the fruit was setting in clusters so heavy they threatened to snap the trellis, and it became terrifyingly clear that the plants knew something I didn't, that they had been waiting for me to stop fighting them with geometry and finally give them the shape they had been craving for millions of years. Now, you might be thinking this is just hippie mysticism, but let me hit you with the hard science, because what we are seeing here is actually simple fluid dynamics applied to biology, and it is undeniable once you understand the mechanism. When wind hits a flat wall or a straight row, it creates turbulence and rapid evaporation, stripping the leaves of moisture, but when it hits a curve, it flows around it effortlessly, creating a protective buffer zone where the air is still and humid, effectively shielding the plants from the dehydrating effects of the atmosphere. But the real magic happens underground, where the fungal networks are trying to build the internet of the soil, and in a square box they hit a 90-degree corner and literally hit a dead end, forcing them to stop and restart, which consumes precious energy. In a circle, however, those mycorrhizal hyphae can spiral endlessly, weaving a dense, uninterrupted web of nutrient exchange that never hits a wall and never breaks its momentum, allowing the colony to communicate faster and transport minerals with zero resistance. This shape effectively creates a thermal vortex. In the center of the bed, a self-regulating microclimate that stays cooler in the scorching heat of midday and holds on to warmth during the cool nights, acting like a biological battery that charges your plants while the rest of the garden is fluctuating wildly with the weather. We have been forcing square pegs into round holes for centuries, but the moment you align the geometry of your bed with the geometry of the root systems, you stop fighting the laws of physics and start surfing the wave of natural energy that has been there all along, waiting for you to tap into it. You can argue with philosophy all day, but you cannot argue with a scale and a water meter. So let's look at the cold, hard data that came out of this season because the numbers are frankly insulting to everything I was taught in school. When I harvested and weighed every single pound of produce from these 5 beds, the difference wasn't a rounding error. It was a landslide victory for the circle, which produced exactly 42% more biomass than the traditional rows and nearly 30% more than the raised boxes, essentially meaning I got almost half a garden for free just by changing the shape. But the most shocking statistic wasn't the yield, it was the input, because I installed flow meters on my irrigation lines and discovered that the keyhole bed drank 35% less water while staying moister longer, proving that the curved edge effect was actively retaining hydration, that the straight lines were hemorrhaging into the atmosphere. I even took a soil penetrometer to measure compaction and found that the root systems in the circular bed had penetrated 18 inches deeper into the subsoil, accessing mineral layers that the plants in the square boxes couldn't even dream of reaching because they were too busy fighting the corners. This isn't just a small improvement, folks. This is a fundamental efficiency gap that proves the industrial model is not designed for maximum output, but for maximum consumption of resources, and we have the receipts to prove it. You might think this is just my luck or some anomaly in my specific climate, but let me introduce you to Sarah, a subscriber from Arizona, who wrote to me last year on the verge of quitting gardening entirely because she had spent thousands of dollars building those perfect Instagram-worthy raised beds only to watch her vegetables scorch and die in the dry heat season after season. She was heartbroken and convinced she just didn't have a green thumb, but then she decided to break the rules one last time and smashed her rectangles to build a messy, imperfect keyhole circle right in the middle of her yard while her neighbors literally stopped at the fence to laugh at what they thought was a crop circle disaster. Fast forward 3 months, and Sarah sent me a picture that I still keep on my desk today, showing her standing next to a wall of kale and tomatoes that was taller than she was, with a smile that said everything about the joy of finally working with nature instead of battling against it. She didn't change her soil mix, and she didn't buy a magical fertilizer. She simply changed the geometry. And suddenly the wind flowed around her plants instead of through them, and the roots found that cool spiral center, and for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't harvesting disappointment. She was harvesting baskets of food so heavy she couldn't carry them alone. This is not an isolated incident because my inbox is flooded with photos from people just like you who dared to step out of the line and into the circle and found that the abundance they were chasing was never about buying more products, but about understanding the fundamental shape of life itself. So are you ready to stop gardening in a cemetery of rectangles and start building an engine of life right now? Because you don't need a degree in architecture. You just need a shovel and the will to break the rules. First, you are going to walk out to the sunniest spot you have and mark out a circle exactly 6 feet in diameter, which is the golden ratio for reach and accessibility. Then you are going to slice a small wedge out of the north side like a piece of cake so you can step into the center without ever compressing the growing soil. Do not dig down into the hard earth. Instead, you are going to build up by laying thick cardboard directly over the grass to smother the old world and invite the worms up to the feast. Then you will pile on a chaotic layer of twigs and old branches which will act as a slow-release carbon skeleton for decades. Cover that skeleton with a mountain of dead leaves and grass clippings and kitchen scraps until you have a mound that looks like a compost heap, because that is exactly what it is, a living, breathing, digestive system that will heat up and feed your plants from below. Finally, crown this organic volcano with 6 inches of your best topsoil and plant your seeds in concentric circles spiraling outward from the center so they can catch every angle of the sun without shading each other out. This isn't just a garden bed, It is a biological reactor that captures solar energy and traps moisture in its core, creating a perpetual growth trigger that fires day and night while you sleep. You will feel the difference the moment you step into that keyhole because you're no longer standing outside the garden looking in, you're standing inside the heart of the organism surrounded by life on all sides. And that is where the real magic begins. This journey was never really about vegetables, because if you think about it, the shape of your garden is actually the shape of your mind. And the reason we are so addicted to the straight line is because it gives us the illusion of control in a world that is inherently chaotic and wild. We build these rigid boxes and march our plants in rows like soldiers because we are terrified of what might happen if we let go of the reins and allow nature to take the wheel. But the moment you step into the center of a circle, you are no longer a dictator, barking orders from the edge of the field. You become the heartbeat of the ecosystem, standing at the nexus where all energy converges. The circle has no beginning and no end. It has no hierarchy and no sharp corners for pests to hide or for energy to stagnate. It is the geometry of inclusion and infinite flow, which is why every ancient culture, from the Celts to the indigenous tribes of the Amazon, built their lives around it. When you change the architecture of your soil, you inadvertently change the architecture of your thoughts, moving from a mindset of extraction where you're trying to squeeze every ounce of productivity out of the earth to a mindset of reciprocity where you are feeding the cycle that feeds you. I realized that my previous failures weren't because I lacked knowledge or effort, but because I was fighting a war against the land, using weapons of geometry that the land did not recognize. And the moment I laid down my arms and built a shape that honored the curvature of the earth, the land rushed to meet me with an abundance that felt less like a harvest and more like a gift. So as you look out at your own patch of earth, whether it is a sprawling backyard or a tiny balcony, I want you to ask yourself the question that changed everything for me. Are you trying to build a factory that obeys your commands, or are you brave enough to build a sanctuary that allows life to happen on its own terms? Script completed.